Welcome everyone to another episode of our podcast AdBites, where we lift the lid on all things Apple search ads. This podcast is brought to you by Redbox Mobile, an award-winning ASO and ASA company. I'm your host, Samuel Chawson, CTO at Redbox Mobile, and I'm joined on today's episode by Lexi Sydow, Head of Insights at data.ai. We're going to be discussing how market trends can impact your Apple search ads cost per download target. I think today's going to be a really interesting episode. But before we delve into the content, Lexi, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Like you said, I'm Lexi Sydow. I am the Head of Insights at data.ai. I've been analyzing the mobile market in the mobile app space for about 8 years now. And the biggest thing, kind of my elevator pitch on it, would be that I help to bring that data to life to make better decisions. So it's all about the impact of the data in the market and how that can help you do better with your mobile apps and games.
Awesome. Thanks very much. So I'm thinking back almost to when I started in this space kind of 4 or so years ago. And one of the hardest bits was often working out what your cost per tap should be, what your cost per download are these competitive, so on and so forth. But I think just to kind of provide a little bit of context to our listeners, could you kind of explain what cost per tap is, what cost per download is, and what the kind of intrinsic relationship between these are?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we've experienced as well is in user acquisition, I think a lot of people look at cost per click, like if you've run more traditional ads, digital ads in the past. So that's kind of the similar thing. So the cost per tap is essentially the cost of getting that user to click the paid search ads. So on the App Store, right at the top, you'll see that kind of blue box. And it's sort of the click to get that, the average of the cost of getting those clicks from that box to your App Store page. And then kind of cost per download is a little bit more downstream. So as you might imagine, it's a little bit cheaper to get the initial tap. And then that download or the install would come after. And that's the cost of sort of users after they've clicked that paid app and they're on your App Store page. Do they then install or download your app? So there's literally, there's an intrinsically higher price with that because there's some drop off point from when people do reach that page. And so they're very related. So you want to make sure the keyword they're coming in on resonates really well with where they end up landing, because that will help that conversion rate from the click to the download. So your App Store assets are extremely important. So that's sort of one of the intersections with traditional App Store optimization or organic optimization, is you want to make sure your value propositions, your creatives, your icon, your app name with potentially any keywords out into the name as well. All of that is really buttoned up because that's what's helping to convert once they land there. It's your kind of organic assets doing that heavy lifting at that point.
And I guess another kind of abbreviation people might hear in this space is CPM, and that's something Apple trialed for a period, and that's cost per mil, and that is around cost per 1,000 impressions. And that is, I guess, charging at the point of surfacing the ad as opposed to kind of charging at the point of clicking on the ad. This is, I guess, one of the ways that Apple is able to ensure users, because they've got a high degree of intent, is that if they're clicking on the advert, you'd assume that there's a high degree of interest surrounding the advert that's been surfaced for them. But it is worth being aware that other products sometimes use an impression-based charging model as well. I guess one of the bits I guess would be interesting to have a look at is, I guess, the manner in which the app is monetized. So whether it's at the point of download or whether it's a subscription app, can have an influence on the CPT. What's your kind of understanding about that?
Yeah, that's been an interesting one. I think some of it's a bit of a bit more, can be a bit related to sort of the style, for instance, in gaming of the game. So hyper casual games tend to monetize not through in-app purchases, for instance. They're more ad based, so you wouldn't have that direct transaction through the App Store. But they also tend to do very well organically. So I think there's that relationship. If they're doing very well organically, likely a lower sort of lower emphasis, less bidding needed essentially from some of those brands. So you would probably have a lower cost per tap for those. I have not seen, when we were looking at our data and the market trends, I was a little bit surprised to see there wasn't a huge amount of variance in terms, for us, we have the ability to look at sort of for subgenres, for instance, like where the app would sit and sort of make some assumptions there. There is variance, but we didn't see an alarming amount between them. It was more based on the country for the cost perspective from that area. But it is an interesting thing to take into account, especially if it's an ad-based model. You're likely to get more individuals on a particular app, right? Because it's free, anyone can use it. It's not downstream, kind of more cost prohibitive. So likely there would be some organic benefits. But I do think the branded keyword has a lot to do here, right? That can do a lot of heavy lifting. If it's Netflix where you're not directly subscribing through the app versus some other players in the US, we've got Pluto, which is a free provider, but Netflix is definitely going to have a very high search volume associated with their term. And then the costs associated with that around if Netflix is bidding on its own term, if other people are trying to capitalize on that search traffic, could drive it up. So in that case, I think the branded might be more of driving the cost there.
Yeah, I remember it was quite interesting when before Disney Plus had an app, obviously that became a very, very competitive term, because that people searching for Disney Plus are looking for a video streaming service. And I know Peacock is similar, because that's, I think, live in the US now, but isn't live in the UK anyway. So all of these are capitalizing on strong brand terms that haven't got apps. And it's kind of interesting to see, especially on those subscription apps, just how competitive those kind of specific terms can become. I guess one of the bits I'm kind of interested to understand is I always struggle with it when somebody asks us a question when they come to us is, what should I set my cost per tap as in Apple search ads? Because that's in effect the control that you have on a per keyword basis. You decide what your cost per tap is going to be, and you've got to work out where you go from there. I've got my own personal views on how users can look to identify that, but I'd be kind of interested to get your insights on that, Lexi.
Yeah. There's, I think, one key way. So, you can utilize tools potentially in the market that can help kind of expedite that process. So at Data.ai, we do have some nice databases that you can see into this sort of area and get an idea of the average cost per tap and per download for specific keywords. And also we can look at sort of trends in the general industry, right? Like how does fast food versus, maybe food delivery, for instance, how do those look? And then that can give you an idea of sort of where you might set your benchmark. In the Data AI tool as well, there is an ability to see for the specific apps bidding on that keyword, are they on par with the average? Are they higher or are they lower? So that gives you kind of an indication of their strategy and how they're ranking. Another sort of interesting area is looking at sort of search volume relative to difficulty, and that's the organic side of, is it a ton of search volume for a particular keyword? So you can get an idea of kind of the demand associated with it from a consumer side, and that could help you inform your how competitive it might be, and then to prioritize kind of your keywords from that. If you can assume if there's a lot more search volume, maybe the potential for you to bid on that to be seen is greater, but it might be more competitive. And then there's also within our tool, there's a sort of paid share of voice as well. So you can kind of see for each keyword, what % of that impressions for the period are owned by, say, one particular app, which can be a good way to get a feel for sort of directionally. So those can definitely help. And we've got some benchmarks that we can kind of share based on our data today that were pretty interesting, and they vary by market. So for instance, for fast food apps, we saw that the cost per tap in the US was sitting around, in March of this year, so just last month, $2.01. In the UK, it was $1.38. These are all back to USD. We convert them to US dollars, but and then the cost per install was about $5.16 in the US and $3.19 in the UK. So there is some free resources like this, like listening to this call as well, or some of the public stuff that we put out, that even if you don't have the tool, those sort of benchmarks that we provide publicly based on the data we're collecting can also be a free tool as well to help sort of get those industry benchmarks to be informed. They will vary by keyword, but just kind of on the whole for keywords associated with some of the top fast food apps, for instance.
That's actually really interesting, because I guess based on those cost per taps and cost per download rates, the average conversion rate's looking around the 30-something%, I think. And that's quite interesting, because Apple generally sees an average conversion rate of 50%. And it's important to kind of not just assume you will definitely achieve a conversion rate of 50%. I mean, for some of our clients, we can see average conversion rates well up into the 80%. But equally, you can see ones where it can be much, much lower down in the 30%. And you really need to factor for that in. So yeah, sorry, just thought I'd throw that in, but kind of, yeah, please carry on.
No, that's fascinating. And actually, when I was looking at this data, I also pulled the max and the min just to get a feel for like, what are some of the max, and this would be the max, for instance, bid for a given keyword within, say the food delivery space in that time. So it could just be one isolated keyword. It could be a number of keywords also hitting that. And that was really interesting too, because for instance, for food delivery, we saw the max that we hit in this time frame was $6.64 from a cost per tap, and then $19.90 in the US for the cost per install.
Wow, that's a big increase.
There's a huge variance there. But then 19, that's almost $20 compared to around the $5 mark in the US. In the UK, the variance was around the max sort of cost per tap was $2.99 compared to the average at $1.35, and then $9.26 for cost per install compared to $3.44. So there can be an extreme amount of variance depending on the country and the kind of type of app as well, which is really interesting. And I think it goes straight to your point before, that some people are going to be getting great conversion rates, very high conversion rates, depending on how those metrics align. And some might be getting very low, right? Even though you were mentioning there's that benchmark of 50%, but depending on how you optimize.
And I think especially with food delivery, it's a type of app where generally the major apps are all providing exactly the same offering. I mean, they've obviously got their own kind of nuances around them. So in that regard, it may be easier to steal potential customers from your competitors. Whereas if you're doing a very high intent activity, I don't know, like I want to download the Wall Street Journal app, it might be harder because you might have a different degree of allegiance because you like the specific offering that news outlet provides.
Right. Absolutely. That's a really good point. And even underlying things like the market appetite. So crypto has historically been higher rates for both metrics in the US compared to many other markets. So that's another interesting one where, some of it is the idea of like what the high intent nature of what you're looking for, and like how easily you can swap these sort of services out versus it's like a unique draw card for you, versus even just the market appetite for some of this stuff, and that also can trend based on sort of how things evolve in a year, or what the sentiment is at the time will really affect that too. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things I think would be interesting to touch on. I think it's really important that you've highlighted that although there are paid tools like data.ai, etc., a lot of companies do publish free benchmark reports. They give talks like these, and those can become really, really, really invaluable. But what other mechanisms could somebody use who perhaps doesn't have the budget for a tool to look at discovering their cost per tap target?
Yeah, I think one way, I mean, that can be done is looking just at if you've set one, at least if you've set your target, and then going to the app stores and seeing sort of what other apps naturally are appearing above in that kind of coveted space for the keyword that you've set certain targets for. So that would give you that indication of if maybe if you're seeing ads that are coming from a competitor, then your cost targets are probably a little bit too low. You might need to increase it there. I think another sort of interesting area is to kind of look at reviews as a tool. This doesn't give you a direct benchmark for like a price to aim for, but looking at reviews and what users are saying about your app or competitors' apps, which are freely available, in the app stores, you can leverage those. And that type of language analysis can give you, a good idea of action and intent, especially, and that can be a really great resource to mine for some other potentially broadening in that way. I think as well, sort of looking at high intent keywords overall might help as well, given the app store's nature of when people go there to search that's an inherently high intent activity you're doing. You want to find a service in that moment. And keywords that kind of plug into that might be able to help with a bit of the longer term or downstream sort of optimization. And then if you don't have a specific tool, there's also just, I think, that testing strategy. It seems a lot of it is, if you are setting a bid and just seeing how it's performing and giving it time to perform, and then adjusting if you're not hitting some of the target metrics that you're looking for around your conversion rate and things like that, then just kind of that iteration is a really natural way to come to your own conclusion around the benchmarks. And I think once you have that, then you could look at some free tools as well for looking at demand over time. Because if you can get a proxy for how the demand might be flowing, then that could help indicate preemptively, once you've gotten your testing sort of your own personal benchmark there, you could probably start to do a little bit of a bit more forecasting around that demand organically, and you can kind of optimize your price around that, given assumptions of how the organic demand might be performing.
I think
like this.
I completely agree, and I think testing is an absolute key and sometimes underutilized component. And I think that one thing you've got to be conscious of is, although testing and tools can give you a good indication of where a competitive price point is, you can't forget you also need to make sure that you're using this as a mechanism to create money for your business. So you need to work out where is the point of monetization in your app, and at what price point do you need to be able to acquire users for them to deliver positive lifetime value, or whatever your measure is for your business. And this is where it gets slightly more complicated, because you might have a 50% conversion from tap to download, but if to subscription, from download to subscription, it might only be 5%. At which point, if you're charging $10 for your subscription, you need to work out, okay, actually I can only afford to pay 50 cents per tap or whatever, in order to make sure that you can attain that. So it's really important you keep revisiting these points, but also you need to look at whether that is actually achievable. Just going, I need to get my users for 10 cents might not be realistic or achievable, and perhaps Apple Search Ads is the wrong mechanism through which to acquire those users. So it's really important to keep kind of reconsidering those things. I don't know if you've got any kind of personal thoughts on that, Lexi.
Oh gosh, I really can't agree more. I think that's such a key aspect of understanding kind of like downstream what it is, right? If you're a mobile commerce app, and your average first order basket price, or, if a user, you've got metrics around, if someone's made an order within X months, like how likely they are to stay, and then how, what's their recurring order and those types of things. But to get that clear benchmark around, as you said, the monetization point, that first order, how much is the average order for that first order? And then what's the return rate, right? How many of those folks stick around and keep making those orders later? Or do you have 50% that make one order and never come back? And having that factor in to know, well, okay, to acquire these new people, then I'd have to factor in not just that first order, but also understanding I've got a 50% drop off after that. So my lifetime value of those people I just brought in has decreased. And like you said, optimizing from there and working kind of backwards makes so much sense. And that's where I think the real critical part of looking at the benchmarks and understanding, and maybe it's looking at sort of across the keywords that you're bidding. Maybe you can afford to spend a bit more when they're like super valuable, and then maybe you need to sort of have a few to balance it out. But that's so important to the overall user acquisition strategy. And we get a lot of questions right now, especially around loyalty and retention of users, and optimizing your spend in accordance with both new users, but also kind of trying to re-engage the lapsed users, because in theory, hopefully they might be, more likely to continue because they know who you are. And a lot of questions around ASO and paid search from a lot of what we'd call mobile first companies that weren't, app first. They might have a physical retail store and then have moved to mobile. We're getting a lot of those questions because budgets are really squeezed right now. So when you don't have as much money, there is that pressure on, okay, we really need to know where it's going. And to your point, kind of tracing that and being able to prove that it's valuable, you've at least got more value from that customer to cover the cost of getting them. And right now we have a huge emphasis on that with folks.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think if you feel like you're going into this like really cold, I would generally recommend almost, if you can, write off an amount of budget that you purely use for discovery purposes, because you might be able to spend $1,000 and work out exactly what those conversion rates are. And you can do that in a kind of fairly controlled fashion, so you're not wasting the money. But then you can work out what the potential beyond that is for scale and opportunity. And that can be a good way of getting organizational buy-in from marketing, but also making sure that you are able to see a clear route to success. And perhaps there isn't one. I think that's always something you should consider. And perhaps other advertising channels may be more successful for what you're trying to achieve. But yeah, it's naive to go in and just assume it will work. You need to make sure that you are testing and also giving yourself the ability to like vary bid prices to see what happens without worrying too much about, oh dear, that's driven this up, we're now in a really bad position. And I guess this is quite an important question, and it's a hard one to answer, which is you can obviously vary the cost per tap price within Apple search ads as frequently as you like. And we often get asked about how frequently should you look to change it. I don't know if you've got any insights into that. If you haven't, I can kind of give my perspective on it, but it'd be great to see if you've got any thoughts.
Yeah, I would defer to you around sort of the general like testing timeframe, and that would definitely be right up Redbox's wheelhouse there. I do think I can speak to sort of what the market movements might look like in terms of when you would want to potentially reset. So for instance, when I spoke of demand before, I think looking clearly at what's, we look at downloads as a, what's in consumer demand, what app downloads are happening organically or not. Organically is going to be your best natural indication of where things are. And a good example of this is, crypto, right? So what we saw, and this is a really interesting data set, was we saw crypto keywords were super competitive, and they reached in the US among sort of the top 10 apps bidding on paid search ads for crypto. We saw nearly 35,000 distinct terms being bid on in June 2021. So that was like the most competitive time. April 2022, it dropped to 16,000. So by like about a 55% decline in the number of keywords being bid on at that time. And then in March 2023, it's now at 4,700. So it dropped by another like 70% there. So this is really interesting around sort of naturally what's happened in the market. And I think you could sort of preempt this and know. So we saw app downloads on the whole drop off in Q2 of 2022 because the crypto market crashed. So people were not super interested in downloading crypto at that time, like they were kind of the previous year. And then we actually saw in the whole of 2022, downloads dropped by about 55% on the whole. And then this year, we're really not seeing a whole lot of uptick. But it was really interesting because that's where the cost per tap and the cost per download worked, it followed a similar flow. So in June 2021, we saw things, basically there was this dropping off effect happening. In June 2022 was when we saw a low occur for cost per tap of $3. It dropped, this is cost per download dropped to $3.60. Cost per tap dropped to $1.81. But then these are now sort of back up to cost per download being $5.34 and cost per tap $2.12. So you can kind of see when these things taper down, the metrics are moving with it. So you could get an idea of that demand and what's happening in the space. And there's other sort of seasonality effects and other environmental factors that can affect these things. And I think that's a really good way, if you're in these spaces, if that happens to be the area that your app sits, is looking at those market trends and then factoring that in can help you sort of identify if you want to lower your metrics because it might not be as competitive at the moment, or possibly it's very competitive. You can see that downloads are ramping, so you can expect to have to pay a bit more. So that's a good way, I think, to kind of help indicate with market data. But I would defer to you on specific advice around how long you leave like a testing strategy in place.
Yeah, I mean, there's loads I kind of want to drill into there. I mean, in terms of testing your cost per tap, it's always worth being aware that there are some reporting delays in Apple search ads, and that means there can be a slight latency between when you actually update your cost per tap price and when that's reflected in the auctions that you enter. We generally wouldn't recommend updating the bid price more than every 4 to 6 hours. It's always kind of good to think of it in terms of almost day chunking or day parting. And more commonly, you will see differences in performance between like morning and evening and overnight, depending on the type of app. So I would generally recommend looking at performing your updates focused around that. And that's a really good way. We always used to say, try not to do more than 4 updates in a 24-hour period. And that means within a day, you've got 4 kind of really solid data points. And within a week, you've got nearly 30 data points, which is a really good place to get to and start to understand how those potential trends and points of emergence can look. One of the things I was really interested in is you talking about the number of keywords that were being utilized in the crypto space, and even at the lowest level of 4,500 odd that you spoke about, that still is massively higher than we often hear clients talking about there being any value in bidding on keywords. We've heard clients say there's no point bidding on more than 10 keywords, and I think that's a really clear indication that actually again, depending on the space that you operate in, users are searching on a much wider basis. It might be that of those 4,500 keywords, 50 of them represent 80% of the search volume, but that still means there's 20% that collectively can be a huge amount of keywords. So I think if you're listening to this, that's a real takeaway, that don't undervalue the small volume keywords, because they might be small value on their own, but when you're talking about potentially 1,000 small volume keywords in aggregate, they become quite impactful. Talking about the kind of the stuff that's going on in the background. I mean, we talk about these as market trends, environmental factors, extraneous factors, loads of different terms for them. And I think that is a hugely important space for people to kind of be aware of. And I mean, looking at crypto, yes, it's suffering a huge kind of market downturn at the moment. If the European Central Bank was to start regulating crypto, that might completely send it in the other direction. So you've always got to kind of keep apprised of this, but also look at the language people are using outside of the App Store. So if people are referring to crypto in a different fashion, there's a strong degree of probability that people will be searching using similar language. What would be good, I guess, is if you've got have you got any other examples of where kind of these environmental factors have kind of pushed around the CPT that you can kind of talk to us about?
Yeah, I think a really interesting one that I think's very relevant as well for folks is around McDonald's. So when we looked at, they announced that they were World Cup sponsors, and they had we saw lots of traction with them with their ad campaign globally. And what was really interesting to see was sort of how that affected the paid search ads in Q4 of last year compared to Q4 the year before. So I pulled some data around that, and it was very, very interesting. We actually saw, for instance, that McDonald's had a massive surge. I'm just grabbing my data points on it because I was very surprised by the scale at which this happened. So we saw in the UK, for instance, so the cost per tap year over year grew 55%. From $1.42. Again, these are kind of normalized to US dollars because we look at multiple countries, but $1.42 to $2.19 during Q4 of last year. And then the cost per download is what really, really grew. And that was $2.49 in Q4 2021. And that grew to $6.13 for the keyword McDonald's in particular, year on year. So 155% growth there. So that's one of those areas, again, it's like an example. And in some ways, that's a fun one that you could probably kind of predict, right? We actually saw in the previous World Cup that food delivery kind of was a great example, kind of from the mobile marketing standpoint of kind of working alongside World Cup, because you've got people in watch parties and ordering food and drinks, and it was a very natural relationship. So we expected to see that again happen, especially since food delivery habits were, catalyzed during COVID and really stayed. We've seen them, even though we've opened back up and people are out and about, food delivery and fast food has really ingrained into our mobile habits. And so that was an interesting one, because this is one of those factors that environmentally you could expect that kind of increase to come, most likely because you'd see such a heavy influence of McDonald's around this time. So for the bidding side of things, that's where you really saw that keyword change. Now, in other markets, this is where it's also interesting from a global standpoint. We see that actually some of the search terms vary dramatically. So organically, McDonald's happens to fall under a number of different names. When we look at sort of what are the search volumes for fast food, McDonald's tends to rank highly in a lot of markets as like the number one, but it depends on the spelling, right? In Australia, they call it Macca's, and that's the term you'll see people search instead of McDonald's. In France, for instance, McDo and then McDonald's was actually organically searched more than the word McDonald's spelled correctly. And it varies by country. And actually in Germany, Mick Space Donald's app was the number one search term for QSR apps in 2022. So it's very different per country. And so even though you would know maybe, okay, I can expect some traction here and more competition, if you were trying to bid on that keyword, you would very much have to diversify for each market. Because in Brazil, for instance, just the word Mick was like the 7th highest searched word in for QSR apps in Brazil. McDonald's was number 1, some other players, the general word burger showed up, and then Mick on its own was its own, ranked above Domino's in search traffic.
That's quite funny. That sort of thing's absolutely fascinating, and I think it really shows the importance of knowing your market. And I know it can be a temptation in Apple search ads and others to just go, I'm just going to target all 60 storefronts. But what can happen is actually you're not as effective in the vast majority of those because you don't understand the markets. And then again, doing your research around that is really, really important. I think one of the other bits that just, if you're listening, to be conscious of is, although we see kind of the average cost per tap increasing in some of these spaces, and the big brands tend to dominate because they've got the purchasing power, it's impossible for any one app to own 100% of the impression share. So even if you don't feel you're able to necessarily compete on a price standpoint 100% of the time, you may still be able to access a small percentage of the search volume if Apple regards your app of having sufficient degrees of relevance, so on and so forth. And that can mean, for a very high volume keyword, even accessing a small percentage of that search traffic can actually have a reasonable impact. So it's always worth, again, testing, trialing, learning, and building on from that. And I really can't impress that strongly enough. So
Absolutely.
I guess there's kind of 1 or 2 last questions would be good to kind of focus in on. And I guess it's actually around forward planning. So reviewing historical data is obviously really important. We've talked really about how important that is. But how kind of best is it to forward plan your CPT strategy? I guess what does that mean as well?
I think one of the natural areas that this sort of forward planning is to understand potentially when you might want to allocate more budget because it might be more competitive. So in terms of seasonality, we see, Q1 is the big part of the year where, for instance, calorie counting apps in the UK and Germany and I think it was Australia was one of the major markets. We saw really strong growth this Q1. We tend to see anything related to New Year's resolutions doing very well from naturally. That's where the demand is. And so you could expect to see potentially it might be a bit more competitive at that time if everyone's also trying to jump on that trend. So I think understanding how that seasonality might affect when and where you allocate your budget is really important. That would, anything finance and health and fitness related tends to spike in Q1, generally speaking. What that also can mean is that it can be an opportunity for you. So there is an app in the UK called Nude, which is a finance app for sort of saving for your first home. And they actually saw H2 of the year, that second half of the year tends to not be a very competitive time. So they actually launched their Google Play app and then had their iOS app in kind of a soft launch essentially for the first part of the year and really ramped up and was able to make some noise in the market because it was a bit of that downtime. And I believe they leveraged mostly organic means to do that. But that could be a really opportune time if you're getting that organic traction to also potentially look at feeding that money into some paid search ads as well to kind of build on that momentum and create that halo effect, because they were able to be the #1 finance app in the UK and beat out huge players, recognizable names you'd see all the time. And those benefits, they've got great PR out of it. And there's benefits that kind of pay dividends beyond just kind of their dollar acquisition strategy there. So I think that's another really interesting piece is how you can, dare I say, like trend jack some of this with when the seasonality effects and try to allocate your budget maybe accordingly so that you're prepared for when you have to pay more or when you could potentially try to optimize because it's a time where it's not as competitive for bidding because historically consumers might not be searching in that way at that time or at that scale rather. So I think those trends are super interesting, and that's a great way to kind of help to bake into your overall plan. There's another great example of within gaming, for instance, we sort of see sometimes recurring events in games, right? And so there's that sort of time where we'll see an event in an in-game event that comes every month. Genshin Impact is a great example of this, where they you see them uptick right at the same time, tailored to that event, and then consumer spend in the game also spikes during that time. And you see it reoccurring with these events. So that's another great way, if you're maybe a competitor, to factor that into your strategy, because you can predict a bit of that behavior looking at the historical data.
I think just to kind of reinforce that, don't always assume that you want a consistent marketing budget for paid search, especially on an ongoing basis. So often we see clients that go, I've got $10,000 a month, that's my marketing budget. It might make significant sense to have $30 in 1 month and have very little in a couple of months following that. So just kind of, again, think about your users, how you're going to target them. Is there things that are happening? And these might be local trends, public holidays, in game events, anything like that that you can kind of build on. Yeah, I mean, we could go on and on about the different things you can be considerate of for hours, but I mean, we're drawing to the end now. And I guess one last question I like to ask all of our kind of speakers or guests is, what do you see as kind of being important or potentially changing in the space you operate, kind of in the coming months or in the next 12 months?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting space. I think, I mean, one of, in terms of like the overall user acquisition on mobile, you know, we've been sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop around sort of crackdown on fingerprinting in terms of IDFA deprecation, things like that. And then, you know, Google Privacy Sandbox. So there's a lot of factors that can affect that spend. And I mean, with gaming in particular, we're wondering about the impacts of that to on in-game spend. The idea being, if it's harder to know where the whales, the guys or women or the people who spend a lot of money, the bulk of the money in the game, and you can't target them, then downstream there's this, you know, you might lose that sort of in-app revenue because you're not finding those people as easily. So I think that's one big area. Again, we get a ton of questions, especially in the gaming space, around that. So that's a big area of a trend that we're sort of watching carefully and seeing how it works. I think there's been a renewed emphasis, as I mentioned, in tighter budgets around organic optimization, but I think that's where paid search ads, I mean, they intrinsically work so well together that we're seeing interest there too, and how those strategies can help with, as I mentioned before, both new users, but also those sort of re-engaged users. And then another trend I think that's really important, especially for markets like the UK and the US, where we see a lot of homegrown retailers doing quite well. We're seeing more of an emphasis of very sophisticated, especially in retail, apps coming out of other markets, and a lot from China, that are breaking into these markets in a way they haven't been able to get that market traction before. So AliExpress was a good example of one that kind of got some traction in you know, Europe and in the US, but we're seeing Shein is a great example, and Temu is the latest one, that they were very sophisticated in their mobile first strategies, and they leveraged paid search ads heavily. And even in the US, you might not necessarily associate kind of, say, kind of an Amazon competitor with strategically leveraging the Super Bowl as like a tentpole event that they were advertising on, and their creatives were all Super Bowl themed in the App Store. They had events. That's another really interesting one where we started to see, we usually see those sort of events, the App Store events that you can list, with games in particular, you know, Pokemon Go Fest and things like that, like emphasizing these activities. Well, Temu was leveraging that for Super Bowl, and it had some gamification around, you know, you can win some free, you know, some free things within the app. And those sophisticated techniques I mean, carving out significant market share for downloads, kind of stepping up the competition with all their bidding strategies. So I think for some markets, it's really important to look at how these mobile first players, very sophisticated in their strategy within the app, and then their user acquisition strategy, are breaking into markets that typically they just haven't been broken into like that, with staying power. So that's one thing I'm very interested in, because I think that's really, there's some older school retailers that are kind of new to the mobile marketing scene, or new to this idea around paid search ads. And then you have this brand new competitor come in and just, they're like, how are they getting this much traction? And there's some very sophisticated paid search strategies happening that are shaking it all up. Ranking high for Walmart and Target in the US, and that's crazy.
Yeah, it's amazing what companies can do when they don't necessarily have the same degree of constraints as well, or kind of they're able to be a bit more free in terms of how they approach it. But amazing, thanks Lexi. It's been super insightful session. Hopefully everyone's learned something. I certainly have. We'll definitely have to get you back again at some point, and chat about some of these market trends again in more detail. But thanks ever so much for your time. Thanks everyone for listening, and look forward to seeing you all again soon.